I need you to understand something before I tell you the rest. I am not a paranoid person. I don't believe in conspiracies. I don't watch videos about government cover-ups at 2 in the morning. I'm a network technician in Richmond, Virginia. I troubleshoot routers and cable infrastructure for a regional telecom company. My name is Joel Marin. I'm 34 years old, and 6 weeks ago I watched the world I understood collapse into something I still can't fully explain. What I can explain is the phone calls. That's where this begins. It was a Thursday in early October. I remember because Thursdays were my short days. I'd finish my last service call around 4, drive back to the office on Broad Street, file my reports, and be home by 6. Home was a second-floor apartment in a brick building off Carey Street that I shared with my girlfriend, Lena. She worked as a veterinary assistant at a clinic near the university. We had a quiet life, a good life, the kind of life that tricks you into thinking the ordinary is permanent. I was sitting in my truck outside a customer's house in the Fan District when my phone buzzed the first time. I looked at the screen and saw a missed call notification. The number was wrong. Not wrong like a spam call, wrong like it shouldn't exist. It read as a 16-digit string. No dashes, no country code, just a long chain of numbers that my phone's interface could barely display without truncating the end. I dismissed it and went back to my paperwork. By the time I reached the office, there were 4 more. Same number, no voicemail. I showed the screen to my coworker, Derek Hollis, who handled fiber optic installs and had an opinion about everything. He leaned over my shoulder and squinted at the string. Probably spoofed, he said. Robo-dialers generate phantom numbers all the time. You'd be amazed what gets through the filters now. 16 digits, though. Could be international overflow. Some trunk lines in Southeast Asia push weird headers through the system. Ignore it. I wanted to ignore it. I tried. But by the time I got home that evening, the count had climbed to 11. Each call had come exactly 9 minutes apart. I timed the last 3. 9 minutes. Not approximately. Exactly. Lena was in the kitchen making pasta when I walked in. She had her hair pulled up and was humming something I didn't recognize. The apartment smelled like garlic and basil, and I wanted to let the evening be normal. I set my phone on the counter and told her about the calls anyway. "That's creepy," she said, not looking up from the pot. "Block the number." I tried. The system won't recognize the format. It doesn't register as a valid number to block. She glanced over. "Then call your carrier." I am my carrier, basically. I work for them. She smiled at that, and for a moment, everything felt balanced again. We ate dinner. We watched an episode of a show we'd been slowly getting through. She fell asleep on the couch around 10, and I carried the plates to the sink. That's when the 12th call came. I watched it ring. The screen lit up with that impossible number, and for reasons I still can't articulate, I answered it. There was no voice, no static, no robotic message or dead air. What I heard was a tone, a single, sustained frequency that sat somewhere between a hum and a vibration. It wasn't loud, it wasn't painful, but it moved through me in a way sound shouldn't. It felt like it reached the back of my skull and pressed against something. I hung up after 4 seconds. My hands were trembling. By midnight, I'd received 16 missed calls total. 16. I know that number precisely because I counted them before deleting the log. I wish I hadn't deleted it. I wish I'd screenshot every single one, because 8 hours later, when the first emergency broadcast hit the local stations, I would have given anything to prove what I already knew. That something had tried to warn me, and I had eaten pasta and gone to bed. I woke at 6:14 a.m. to Lena shaking my shoulder. Her grip was tight enough to leave small bruises I'd discover later. Her face was pale in the blue half-light of dawn, filtering through the blinds, and she was holding her phone in her other hand with the screen facing me. "Joel, look." The local news app was showing a red banner I'd never seen before. "Emergency alert, Richmond Metro." Below it, the text was scrambled with the kind of language officials use when they don't want to cause panic but have already lost control. Unexplained public health incident, shelter-in-place advisory, multiple hospitals at capacity, avoid contact with symptomatic individuals. "What does symptomatic mean in this context?" Lena asked. Her voice was steady, but her jaw was tight. I sat up and took the phone. The article beneath the banner was thin, 3 paragraphs, mostly bureaucratic hedging. But embedded in the second paragraph was a line that detonated quietly inside my chest. "Reports of aggressive and erratic behavior among affected individuals have been confirmed in the Manchester, Shockoe Bottom, and Church Hill neighborhoods." Those weren't distant places. Church Hill was 12 minutes from our apartment. I got out of bed and turned on the television. Every local channel was carrying the same feed, a wide shot of VCU Medical Center, with ambulances stacked at the entrance like freight cars. The anchor's voice was professional but thin. She kept touching her earpiece. Behind her, through the studio window, I could see a column of smoke rising from somewhere near the river. "I need to call the clinic," Lena said. She was already dressed, scrubs, sneakers, her hair tied back. She worked with animals all day, but she had the steadiest hands of anyone I knew. "If this is some kind of pathogen, they'll need everyone." "You're not going out there." "Joel, I'm not asking permission." That was Lena. She didn't argue. She stated positions. And in nearly 3 years together, I had learned that the quiet certainty in her voice was not something I could override. But this morning, standing in our dim bedroom with the television cycling through emergency graphics, I felt a different gravity pulling at every decision. "At least wait until we understand what this is," I said. She compromised. She would call first. If the clinic was open, she'd drive. If not, she'd stay. I used that window to call Derek. He picked up on the second ring, which surprised me. Derek was not a morning person. "You watching this?" he said immediately. His voice had a texture I'd never heard from him. Derek was the kind of man who made jokes at funerals. This morning, he sounded scraped raw. "Just woke up to it. What do you know?" "More than the news is saying. My cousin works EMS out of Station 15. He called me at 4 a.m., said they responded to 9 calls in 2 hours in Shockoe Bottom. All the same thing, people attacking other people. Biting. Not punching, not shoving. Biting. And the ones doing it? He said their eyes were wrong. Said they looked through you. He said one woman they restrained had a core temperature of 106 and was still moving like she felt nothing." I sat down on the edge of the bed. The television was showing a helicopter shot now. The roads near the medical center were gridlocked. "Derek, I got those phone calls yesterday." "The weird number?" 16 of them, 9 minutes apart. I answered one and heard this tone, this frequency. I don't know how to describe it. He was quiet for a moment. "My sister-in-law got calls like that. Tuesday night. She's in Norfolk. She said half the people on her block got them." A cold vine threaded through my stomach. Did anything happen in Norfolk? Not yet. But she said her neighbor, who answered the longest call, he held on for almost a minute. He started running a fever Wednesday afternoon. She hasn't seen him since. Through the wall of our apartment, I heard our neighbor's television playing the same emergency broadcast. The sound of the anchor's voice, doubled and slightly out of sync, created a strange echo that made the information feel like it was surrounding us. Lena appeared in the doorway. Clinic's closed. They're evacuating the animals to a partner facility in Charlottesville. She paused, reading my face. What did Derek say? I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, then walked to the window and looked out at Carey Street below. I joined her. The road wasn't empty, but it was wrong, a handful of cars moving too fast, a woman running on the sidewalk carrying a child, and in the distance, the staccato pulse of sirens layering over each other like an orchestra tuning to a note no one had written. We should leave, she said. The decision to leave felt obvious in the apartment and became complicated the moment we stepped outside. Our building had 8 units, and by 7:30 a.m., 3 of our neighbors were already loading cars. I recognized Paul Oshiro from the ground floor, a retired Marine who walked with a slight limp and kept his silver hair regulation short, standing beside his truck with a duffel bag and a shotgun case. His wife, Marguerite, was in the passenger seat clutching a small dog. Where are you headed? I asked. West. My brother has land outside Staunton. 40 acres, well water, good fences. He looked at Lena, then at me. You two have a plan? I didn't. Lena did. My parents are in Lexington, she said. They have a farmhouse. I looked at her. We hadn't discussed this. She returned my gaze with the calm arithmetic of someone who had already calculated options while I was still processing the question. Lexington's what? 3 hours on I-64? Paul said. If the highway's moving, I replied. It won't be for long. Get ahead of it. He shook my hand, a firm, economical grip, and climbed into his truck. We watched him pull out and turn west. I wouldn't see Paul again for 19 days, and when I did, the man I met would be carrying a very different kind of weight. We went back upstairs and packed. I was methodical about it. Years of service calls had taught me to think in terms of what you actually need versus what makes you feel prepared. I grabbed tools, first aid supplies, water bottles, non-perishable food from the pantry, a flashlight, batteries, and the emergency radio I'd bought during a hurricane scare 2 years prior. Lena packed clothes, medications, her phone charger, and a small leather case I hadn't seen before. What's that? I asked. Ketamine and sedatives from the clinic's emergency stock. Dr. Pham told everyone to take what they could carry before they locked up. I stared at her. You have veterinary tranquilizers. I have tools that might matter. We loaded the car, my 12-year-old Honda Civic, reliable and unremarkable, and were on the road by 8:15. The streets of Richmond were sliding into controlled chaos. Traffic signals were still functioning, but drivers had abandoned the social contract. Intersections became negotiations conducted through horn blasts and lurching forward motion. I took Patterson Avenue toward the highway, avoiding the downtown corridor entirely. At the entrance to I-64 West, we hit our first wall. The on-ramp was backed up half a mile. Cars were barely creeping. Some people had pulled onto the shoulder. Others had gotten out and were standing beside their vehicles, looking at their phones or staring at the skyline behind us. I could see 3 separate smoke columns rising from the east side of the city. Surface roads, Lena said. I nodded and pulled off before we committed to the ramp. We took Route 250 West instead, threading through short stretches of suburban sprawl and then into the first exhalations of rural Virginia. The road was busy but moving. Every few minutes, a vehicle going the opposite direction toward Richmond would flash its headlights at us. I didn't know if it was warning or panic. 40 minutes outside the city, near a town called Goochland, we saw our first sign that this was not a localized event. A gas station on the right side of the road had its windows shattered. The pumps were still on, fuel pooling in iridescent sheets across the asphalt. A minivan sat with its driver door open and the engine running, but no one was inside. On the far side of the lot, near the tree line, a figure stood perfectly still. Lena saw it first. "Joel, don't slow down." I looked. The figure was a man, mid-40s, heavy-set, wearing a gas station uniform. He was standing with his arms slightly away from his body, his head tilted at an angle that made my neck ache in sympathy. Even at 40 miles an hour, passing in 2 seconds, I could see that his skin had a grayish undertone that didn't belong to any living complexion I'd encountered. And he was watching us. Not looking, watching. His head tracked the car with a mechanical smoothness that bypassed every instinct I had about how human bodies move. I pressed the accelerator. Lena's hand found my knee and squeezed once, then released. We didn't speak for the next 20 miles. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was full of parallel processing, two minds running independent calculations toward the same unspoken conclusion. The world had changed while we slept, and the change wasn't theoretical anymore. It had a face. It had a posture. It was standing in a gas station parking lot in Goochland County with dead eyes and a head that moved like a surveillance camera. I turned on the emergency radio around mile marker 140. The signal was fractured local stations cutting in and out, some broadcasting automated loops, others carrying live feeds from anchors who sounded like they were narrating their own disbelief. I caught fragments. CDC advisory. Unknown pathogen. Incubation period estimated at 6 to 18 hours. Neurological deterioration. Extreme aggression in advanced stages. 6 to 18 hours, Lena repeated. That's incredibly fast. For what? For anything. Rabies takes weeks. Even the fastest viral encephalitis strains need days to produce behavioral changes. Whatever this is, it's not following any model I've studied. Lena had a biology degree she rarely mentioned. She'd gone into veterinary work because she preferred animals to academic politics, but the foundation was still there. When she spoke about pathology, her voice shifted into a register that was precise and detached to clinical frequency that I found both reassuring and unsettling. "The calls," I said. Derek's sister-in-law said her neighbor answered one for almost a minute and got sick the next day. You answered for 4 seconds. I know. How do you feel? I took inventory. No fever, no headache, no confusion beyond the ambient terror of the situation. Normal, scared, but normal. Keep telling me if that changes. Route 250 carried us through Charlottesville's southern fringe. The city was awake and agitated. I could see traffic snarling at every intersection we passed. People moving on sidewalks with the jerky urgency of disturbed ants. A police cruiser screamed past us going east, then another. The university campus, visible briefly through a gap in the tree line, had emergency vehicles parked on its central lawn. Beyond Charlottesville, the road climbed into the Blue Ridge foothills, and the density of human habitation thinned. The trees closed in. The sky, which had been overcast all morning, began to break apart, letting through columns of pale October sunlight that striped the asphalt. Under other circumstances, it would have been beautiful. My phone rang. The sound detonated in the quiet car like a gunshot. Lena flinched. I looked at the screen. It was Derek. "Don't answer on speaker," Lena said. Then, "Actually do. I want to hear." I accepted the call and put it on the dashboard mount. "Joel." Derek's voice was different again. The rawness from this morning had been replaced by something compressed and controlled, like a man speaking carefully to avoid screaming. Where are you? Past Charlottesville. Heading to Lexington. Good. Don't come back to Richmond. What happened? They're everywhere, man. I went to my mom's place in Church Hill to get her out, and the street was... I don't know how to describe it. There were people walking in the road, not walking, moving, like they forgot how legs work and were figuring it out from scratch. And then one of them saw me, and it was like a switch flipped. She ran at my car so fast I barely got the window up. I heard him swallow. It was a thick, difficult sound. Is your mom okay? She's in the back seat. We're on 64 headed west, but it stopped. Completely stopped. There are cars abandoned on the highway. People are walking between the lanes. Some of them are bleeding, and I can't tell if they're hurt or if they're... He stopped. I heard Marguerite. No. His mother say something indistinct in the background. Derek, listen to me. Get off the highway. Take the next exit and use back roads. Route 250 is still moving. If I can reach the exit. Joel, one more thing. The calls. I got them too. Last night after we talked. 14 calls, same number. I didn't answer any of them. But my phone played the first one as a voicemail somehow. I heard the tone. Lena leaned forward. Derek, how long was the voicemail? 11 seconds? And how do you feel? Silence. Then, I've had a headache since 3 a.m. Figured it was stress. Lena looked at me. In her eyes, I saw a calculation completing a grim equation, balancing exposure duration against symptom onset. Derek, she said carefully, if that headache gets worse, or if you start feeling confused or feverish, you need to tell someone immediately. Don't drive. Pull over and tell your mother. You think the tone did something to me? Neither of us answered. The road curved through a mountain pass, and for a moment the signal wavered, Derek's voice dissolving into digital fragments before resolving again. Just get somewhere safe, I said. Call me when you stop. He said he would. He didn't. We reached Lexington at 11:40 a.m. The town sat in the Shenandoah Valley like a painting of itself: brick buildings, white church steeples, the Virginia Military Institute campus perched on a hill with its Gothic barracks catching the midday light. Under the emergency that was consuming the eastern part of the state, Lexington looked almost offensively peaceful. But the peace was cosmetic. As we drove down Main Street, I noticed that half the storefronts were already closed. The hardware store had a handwritten sign taped to its door, closed until further notice. A cluster of VMI cadets in gray uniforms stood outside the barracks gate, talking with an intensity that didn't match their rigid postures. At the single traffic light in the center of town, a sheriff's deputy sat in his cruiser with the engine running, watching traffic with the expression of a man waiting for something he hoped wouldn't arrive. Lena's parents lived 7 miles outside town, on a property that had been in her mother's family for 4 generations. The farmhouse was a white clapboard structure with a wraparound porch, a detached barn, and 40 acres of mixed pasture and woodland that backed up to the George Washington National Forest. Her father, Frank Callis, was a retired civil engineer who had spent his post-career years turning the property into a model of rural self-sufficiency solar panels, a deep well, a root cellar stocked with canned goods, a wood stove, and a workshop that could service anything mechanical. Her mother, Diana, was a former schoolteacher who now managed the property's garden and small flock of chickens with the organizational precision of a military quartermaster. She was standing on the porch when we pulled up the gravel drive, one hand shielding her eyes from the sun, the other holding a portable radio. "We've been calling you for 2 hours," she said as Lena got out of the car. "Service has been dropping in and out," Lena replied, embracing her. Frank appeared from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He was a tall, lean man with wire-rimmed glasses and the unhurried demeanor of someone who had spent decades solving structural problems. He shook my hand and looked at the car. "What did you bring?" "Food, water, tools, first aid kit. Lena has medical supplies from the clinic." He nodded. "Good. Come inside. I want to show you both something." The kitchen table was covered with maps, actual paper maps, the kind gas stations used to sell. Frank had marked them with colored pencils. Red circles around major cities: Richmond, Norfolk, Charlottesville, Roanoke. Blue lines along highways, green shading over rural zones with low population density. "I've been tracking the broadcasts since 5 this morning," he said. "This isn't just Richmond. Norfolk started reporting cases around 2 a.m. D.C. went dark an hour ago. All the local stations switched to automated emergency loops. Roanoke hasn't reported anything yet, but their hospital is already turning people away as a precaution." "D.C. went dark?" I repeated. The last live broadcast I caught from a D.C. station was at 9:15. An anchor was reading an evacuation advisory for the Capitol Hill area. Then the feed cut. It hasn't come back. Diana set mugs of coffee on the table without being asked. The normalcy of the gesture, ceramic mugs, the smell of French roast, a sugar bowl with a small silver spoon, created a dissonance that made the maps and their red circles feel like props in a film we hadn't agreed to be in. "The question," Frank continued, settling into a chair and removing his glasses to clean them, "is whether this stays east or moves west. The valley has natural bottlenecks. The Blue Ridge to the east, the Alleghenies to the west. If the mountain passes get blocked or controlled, this area becomes defensible." "Defensible against what, exactly?" Lena asked. She sat across from him, and I watched the dynamic shift: daughter becoming colleague, family dinner becoming operational briefing. We saw one on the way here, near Goochland, standing in a gas station lot. It wasn't attacking anyone, but the way it moved its head. "The broadcasts are calling them affected individuals," Diana said from the counter. "Some channels are using the word infected. Nobody's using the word we're all thinking." Nobody said it. We didn't need to. The word had been circulating in the cultural imagination for decades, in films, games, television shows, novels. We had rehearsed this scenario as entertainment so many times that confronting it as reality felt like stepping through a screen into a world we recognized but had never truly believed in. Frank spread his hands over the maps. "Whatever we call them, we need to plan for the possibility that they reach the valley. And we need to plan today." Frank's planning instinct was infectious in the best possible way. Within 2 hours of our arrival, the farmhouse had transformed from a retirement property into something approaching a coordinated outpost. Frank and I walked the perimeter of the acreage, identifying sight lines, access points, and natural barriers. The property's western edge bordered the national forest's dense hardwood and pine that would slow any approach on foot. The eastern side faced a county road with open pasture on both sides, offering clear visibility for a quarter-mile in each direction. The north and south borders were fenced not fortress grade, but enough to funnel any approach to the front drive or the rear tree line. "The barn is the weak point," Frank said, standing at the edge of the pasture and looking back at the structures. "Big doors, multiple entry points. If we need to fall back, the house has better fewer windows on the ground floor. Solid construction, and the root cellar as a last resort." "You've thought about this before," I said. "I'm a structural engineer. Every building I've ever walked into, I've evaluated for failure points. It's compulsive. My wife finds it exhausting." A faint smile crossed his face, then dissolved. "But I never thought I'd be doing it for this reason." We returned to find that Lena and Diana had conducted their own inventory. The root cellar held enough canned food and dry goods for 4 people for approximately 6 weeks. The well was functional, and the solar panels were generating enough power to run essential systems. Diana had a shortwave radio in addition to the portable AM/FM unit. And she'd been cycling through frequencies, collecting fragments of information from amateur operators across the region. A man in Lynchburg says his neighborhood is organizing a checkpoint, Diana reported. Another operator in Staunton says the National Guard has been mobilized, but they're concentrating on D.C. and Richmond. Nobody's coming out here. That last sentence landed with a weight that restructured everything. Nobody's coming out here. In normal emergencies, hurricanes, floods, ice storms, the expectation was always that help was on the way. Someone was coming. Some agency, some uniformed body, some system designed for exactly this kind of crisis. But Diana's words acknowledged what the rest of us were still processing. The systems were either overwhelmed or collapsing, and the gap between us and organized response was growing wider by the hour. Around 3 p.m., a truck came up the gravel drive. Frank picked up the rifle he'd placed by the front door, a bolt-action hunting rifle he used for deer season, and stepped onto the porch. I followed with a tire iron I'd taken from the car, feeling absurd and terrified in equal measure. The truck was a battered Ford pickup. The driver was a woman in her 50s with sun-weathered skin and a camouflage jacket over a flannel shirt. She killed the engine and raised both hands through the open window before stepping out. "I'm Connie Ware. I live on the Collier Road property, 4 miles north. I'm not sick and I'm not looking for trouble." Frank lowered the rifle slightly. "I know your property. Your husband's the one with the cattle operation. My husband died in March. The cattle are mine." She looked at the house, at the solar panels, at us. "I've been listening to the radio all day. I came here because your place is the most put-together property in a 20-mile radius, and I figured whoever lives here might have a plan." Frank glanced at me. I shrugged. Lena appeared in the doorway behind us. "Come inside," she said. Connie Ware sat at the kitchen table and told us what she'd seen that morning. She'd driven into Lexington for feed supplies and found the farm store locked. On her way back, she'd passed a car stopped in the middle of Route 11 with both doors open. A man was lying face down on the center line. She'd almost stopped to help when she saw a second figure standing in the ditch, a teenage girl in pajamas, barefoot, staring at the car with an expression Connie described as blank hunger. The girl had started walking toward Connie's truck with a gait that accelerated from shuffle to sprint in the space of 3 seconds. Connie had floored it. "She hit the tailgate," Connie said. Her voice was flat, factual, armored. I felt the impact through the chassis. When I looked in the mirror, she was getting up again. From a collision at 30 miles an hour, she was getting up. Diana poured Connie a cup of coffee. The sugar bowl made its second rounds. And outside, the October sun moved behind a bank of clouds, and the valley dimmed, as though the landscape itself was bracing. 3 days passed in a strange suspension between crisis and routine. Frank organized the property with the discipline of a man who believed that structure was the only reliable defense against chaos. We established watch rotations 2-hour shifts, day and night, from the second-floor bedroom that offered the widest view of the approach road and pasture. Connie drove back to her property and returned with a truck bed full of supplies. A generator, 50 pounds of dried beans, a chest freezer's worth of beef she'd butchered the day before, and 2 rifles with ammunition. "I was married to a rancher and a Marine," she said, handing me a .30-06 with the casual expertise of someone passing a wrench. "He taught me to shoot before he taught me to cook." Lena set up a small medical station in the downstairs bathroom, the veterinary sedatives, a suture kit, antiseptic, bandages, the kinds of supplies that seemed inadequate against the scale of what was coming, but were infinitely better than nothing. Diana maintained the radio watch, logging every transmission in a spiral notebook with timestamps and source frequencies. The notebook became our primary intelligence document, a handwritten archive of the world's disintegration. On the second day, the power grid failed. It didn't happen dramatically, no explosion, no visible cause. The lights simply didn't come on when Diana flipped the kitchen switch at dusk. Frank checked the main panel and confirmed that the grid connection was dead. The solar system kicked in automatically, but it could only sustain essentials: refrigeration, the radio, limited lighting. We shifted to oil lamps and candles for everything else, and the farmhouse took on the amber glow of a previous century. The radio transmissions grew worse. On Friday morning, an amateur operator in Roanoke reported that the city's hospitals had been overrun, not by patients seeking treatment, but by patients who had turned while being treated. The operator described nurses and doctors fleeing into parking lots, while figures in hospital gowns pursued them through corridors. He was broadcasting from his attic. Midway through his transmission, we heard glass breaking in his background, then silence. That afternoon, Diana picked up a military frequency, scrambled but partially intelligible. The fragments we caught suggested that the National Guard had established a perimeter around D.C., but had been forced to fall back twice. Someone used the phrase "total loss of containment," and then the frequency went dead. "They can't hold the cities," Frank said quietly. He was standing at the kitchen window, watching the tree line. His rifle leaned against the wall within arm's reach, and I noticed he'd started carrying a handgun in a belt holster, a compact revolver he'd shown me in his workshop safe. "Then it reaches us eventually," I said. Eventually is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Could be days, could be hours. Connie was on watch upstairs. Lena was in the barn, organizing supplies into categories: medical, food, tools, fuel, with a system of labeled bins that made me think of her clinic days, the precise way she managed inventory for a workplace that no longer existed. I found myself standing on the porch at sunset, listening. The valley was quiet in a way that rural places often are. Wind in the trees, a distant crow, the settling sounds of old wood. But underneath the familiar silence was a new absence. No engine noise from the county road. No contrails in the sky. No hum of electrical infrastructure carrying the background frequency of civilization. The world had become acoustically naked. And in that nakedness I heard how much of what I'd always called silence was actually the sound of systems functioning. My phone was dead. Not broken, the battery was charged, the screen lit up. But the cellular network was gone. No signal, no data, no connection to anything beyond the physical reach of my voice. The last text I'd received was from Derek, sent Friday at 1:12 a.m. "Stopped outside Waynesboro. Mom is sleeping. Head is killing me. We'll call tomorrow." He never called. I read that text probably 100 times in the following days, looking for something in the words that might tell me he was okay. But words on a screen are just light arranged in patterns, and they hold no more truth than you're willing to project onto them. Derek was either alive or he wasn't. The uncertainty was its own wound, one that didn't bleed but never closed. On Sunday morning, 4 days after the outbreak, the infected reached the valley. Connie saw them first. She was on the dawn watch, wrapped in a wool blanket in the upstairs bedroom, binoculars trained on the county road. Her voice came down the stairs measured and clear, the way someone speaks when they are committed to not panicking. 2 figures on the road, eastbound, moving erratically. Frank and I were at the window within a minute. Through the binoculars, I could see them, two people, maybe a quarter-mile away, walking on the center line of the road. Their gait was distinctive and wrong. One of them, a man in a dark jacket, moved with a lurching cadence, his torso listing forward as though his center of gravity had shifted. The other was smaller, a woman or an adolescent. Difficult to tell at that distance, and she moved in short, agitated bursts, like a bird pecking at the ground. Stop, start, stop, start. They're not together, Connie said. Watch. They're not interacting with each other at all. She was right. The two figures moved in proximity but without acknowledgement, like strangers sharing a sidewalk in a city. No communication, no coordination. Just two damaged systems following the same road in the same direction. What happens when they see us? I asked. Depends on whether they're in the passive stage or the aggressive stage, Lena said. She'd come upstairs and was watching through the window with the diagnostic intensity she usually reserved for sick animals. From what the broadcasts described, there seemed to be two phases. A slow phase, low awareness, minimal response to stimuli, and an active phase triggered by proximity to uninfected individuals. The switch, Connie said, like what happened with the girl on the road. Exactly. The question is, what triggers the switch? Sound, sight, scent? We don't know. Frank made a decision. We stay inside, lights off, no noise. If they pass the property without detecting us, we let them go. We killed every light in the house, drew every curtain. The five of us gathered in the kitchen, away from windows, and waited. The silence became a texture, thick and pressurized, broken only by our breathing and the faint ticking of the mantel clock in the living room. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Connie crept upstairs and returned with an update. The two figures had continued east past the property without stopping. One of them had paused briefly near our mailbox, a moment that Connie described with the forced calm of someone recounting a near-miss car accident, and then moved on. We exhaled. They'll be back, Frank said, or others will. The question isn't whether we'll be found, it's when and how many. That afternoon, Frank and I reinforced the ground floor windows with plywood from the barn. We dragged the heavier farm equipment, a tractor tire, a steel feeding trough, old fencing into positions that would channel any approach toward the front of the house, where we had the clearest sight lines. Connie suggested trip lines with noisemakers cans filled with gravel, strung at ankle height across the drive and along the fence line. It was primitive, almost laughable. But in a world without functioning infrastructure, primitive meant functional. While we worked, Diana stayed on the radio. She caught a transmission from a group in Buena Vista, a town 15 miles northeast, that had organized a community defense. They were barricading the main bridge into town and establishing armed patrols. The voice on the radio was a man named Curtis, who identified himself as a former sheriff's deputy. "We've got about 60 people here," Curtis said. "Good mix. Some military, some medical, some just willing bodies. The infected have been coming down Route 60 in groups of 3 to 5. We've been able to redirect most of them, but we had a breach last night. Lost 2 people." "Lost how?" Diana missed. "Bitten. The infection spreads through bites that's confirmed now. Saliva to bloodstream. Once you're bitten, you've got about 12 hours before the fever starts, and maybe 6 more before you're gone. There's no treatment. Nobody's coming back from this." Diana wrote everything down. When she related to us that evening, the information settled over the kitchen table like a change in atmospheric pressure. No treatment. Nobody comes back. The equations we'd been doing in our heads, the quiet cost-benefit analyses of risk and safety, all recalculated around those 2 facts. That night, on my watch shift, I stood at the upstairs window and looked out at the dark valley. No lights anywhere. No street lamps, no headlights, no glow on the horizon from nearby towns. The stars were brighter than I'd ever seen them, the Milky Way, visible in a way it hadn't been in my lifetime. The universe revealing itself in the absence of human illumination. It was magnificent and devastating simultaneously. Beauty purchased by catastrophe. I thought about the phone calls, 16 missed calls from a number that shouldn't exist. I had answered one for 4 seconds and heard a tone that pressed against the interior of my skull. Derek had been exposed to 11 seconds of it through a voicemail and had developed a headache within hours. The neighbor in Norfolk had listened for nearly a minute and hadn't been seen since. What was the tone? A weapon? A signal? A biological trigger disguised as sound? I didn't have answers. I had only the arithmetic of exposure, 4 seconds, and I was still myself. But the question pulsed quietly beneath every other thought. Was 4 seconds enough? Was there a threshold I hadn't crossed, or a timer I couldn't see? A week into the outbreak, we had our first real crisis, and it wasn't the infected. A group of 7 people arrived at the property in 2 vehicles around midday. They stopped at the end of the drive, and a man got out with his hands raised. He was young, maybe mid-20s, with a closely shaved head and a leather jacket that didn't suit the October chill. He identified himself as Travis and said the group had been traveling from Lynchburg, that they'd run low on fuel and food, and that they were looking for a place to rest before continuing west. Frank and I met them at the fence. Connie watched from the upstairs window with a rifle. Lena and Diana stayed in the house. "We're not looking for trouble," Travis said. His hands were steady, but his eyes moved constantly, scanning the property with an assessment that felt more tactical than anxious. "We've got women and kids in those cars. We just need a place to stop for the night." I looked at the vehicles. In the first, a sedan, I could see a woman in the passenger seat and 2 children in the back. In the second, a larger SUV, 3 figures sat with the kind of stillness that comes from exhaustion or resignation. "How many in your group are sick?" Frank asked. "Nobody's sick. I need to see everyone out of the vehicles." Travis hesitated. A calculation passed across his face, the assessment of whether to cooperate or resist, a decision that in the old world might have been about pride, but in this new context was about survival geometry. "All right." He turned and waved. The vehicles emptied. 7 people, Travis, a woman named Keisha, early 30s, holding the hand of a boy who looked about 6, an older man named Walter, who moved slowly and wheezed when he breathed, a teenage girl named Sade, who stood apart from the group with her arms crossed and her jaw set, 2 men in their 20s, Marcus and Benny, who had the wary, competent bearing of people who'd already survived encounters they didn't want to discuss. Lena came out and did a basic assessment temperature checks with a forehead thermometer, a visual scan for bite marks, questions about symptoms. Everyone cooperated except Marcus, who pulled his arm away when Lena reached for his wrist. "I'm checking your pulse, not arresting you," Lena said. "Nobody touches me without asking. I'm asking." He extended his arm. Everyone cleared. No fevers, no visible wounds, no signs of infection. Frank and I conferred briefly and agreed to let them stay the night in the barn, which we'd cleared of most supplies already. We'd provide food and water. In the morning, they'd move on. The first night went fine. Travis's group kept to themselves. Keisha's son, who she called Dion, played with a toy car in the barn doorway while the adults rested. Diana brought out blankets and a thermos of soup. The gesture was generous and uncomplicated. The kind of human exchange that felt like a defiant act against the entropy consuming everything beyond our fence line. The problem began on the second morning. Travis didn't want to leave. "We've been driving for 3 days," he said. We were standing by the fence again, the same positions as before, the geography of negotiation. Every town we've passed through is either empty or hostile. People are turning on each other as fast as the infected are turning. You've got space here, supplies, defenses. We can contribute Marcus and Benny no construction. Keisha was a nurse before the kid. We're not dead weight. Frank was quiet for a long time. I watched him weigh the argument. More hands meant more capability, but also more mouths, more variables, more potential for conflict. The mathematics of community in a crisis are merciless. Every person added is both an asset and a liability. And the ratio between those two categories shifts based on factors you can't always predict. "We need to discuss it," Frank said. "Give us an hour." The discussion in the kitchen was the first real argument we'd had. Connie was against it flatly, firmly, with the pragmatism of a woman who'd been running a property alone and understood the cost of every resource. "We have enough for 5 people for 6 weeks. Add 7 more and that drops to less than 3. 3 weeks. And that's assuming nothing goes wrong. No medical emergencies, no increase in infected activity, no damage to the water system." "Keisha is a nurse," Lena countered. "That's worth more than 2 weeks of canned corn." "Marcus makes me nervous," I said. "The way he reacted to the health check. And the way Travis scans the property, he's not looking at it like a guest. He's looking at it like an opportunity." "You're projecting," Lena said. "I'm reading behavior. It's what I do on service calls, assess a situation before committing resources." Diana listened to everyone, then spoke. "We can't save everyone, but we can't survive alone either. There's a middle ground here if we're willing to find it." Frank made the final call. Travis's group could stay for 1 week. During that week, they would contribute labor, follow house rules, and accept the authority structure Frank established. At the end of the week, we'd reassess. If it wasn't working, they'd leave with a share of supplies for the road. Travis agreed. The handshake felt provisional. Both parties understood that the agreement was written in pencil, not ink. The first 3 days of cohabitation were productive. Marcus and Benny proved their value immediately. They reinforced the barn's structural weaknesses, built a secondary barricade along the drive using materials from a collapsed fence on the far side of the property, and constructed a rainwater collection system from guttering and plastic sheeting that added a backup water source independent of the well. Keisha integrated into Lena's medical operation, bringing knowledge of human pharmacology that complemented Lena's veterinary expertise. Walter, despite his age and breathing difficulties, turned out to be a retired electrician who improved our solar setup's efficiency by 20% within an afternoon. Even Sade, the teenager who'd barely spoken since arriving, found a role. She was fast, observant, and fearless in a way that teenagers sometimes are not from bravery, but from an incomplete understanding of mortality. She volunteered for watch shifts and proved to have sharper eyes than any of the adults. 4 figures, tree line, northwest, moving south. She'd report with the clipped precision of someone narrating a video game. Except it wasn't a game, and the figures were real. And every sighting increased the pressure on our shrinking margin of safety. The infected were arriving in the valley in growing numbers. Not a flood, not yet, but a steady, increasing trickle, like water finding cracks in a dam. Diana's radio contacts confirmed the pattern. The eastern cities had become uninhabitable, and the surviving population was moving west through the mountain passes, with the infected following the same routes. The bottleneck Frank had hoped would protect us was functioning as a funnel instead, concentrating both refugees and infected into the same narrow corridors. On the fourth day, Travis came to me while I was chopping firewood behind the barn. He leaned against the woodpile and watched me work with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Your girlfriend's father runs a tight ship," he said. "He's good at what he does. What he does is give orders. The question is whether those orders serve everyone or just his family." I set down the axe. "What are you getting at?" "The food rationing. His daughter and his wife get the same portions as the rest of us. I'm not questioning that. But the decisions about when we eat, what we eat, how the supplies are distributed, that's all him. And if things get worse, if we have to make hard choices about who eats and who doesn't, I want to know that those choices aren't going to be made by one man with an obvious bias toward his own blood." It was a reasonable concern expressed through an unreasonable lens. Travis wasn't wrong that Frank held disproportionate authority. But the authority existed because it was Frank's property, Frank's supplies, and Frank's planning that had created the infrastructure keeping all of us alive. Redistributing control in the name of fairness would undermine the competence that was our primary survival advantage. "Frank's not hoarding anything," I said. "Every decision he's made has been transparent. For now. If you have a specific complaint, bring it to the group. I'm bringing it to you because you're the one person here who isn't his family or a stranger. You're in between. You see both sides." He walked away before I could respond. I stood there with the axe in my hand and the October wind pulling at my jacket. And I felt the first hairline crack in the foundation of our arrangement. That evening, the crack widened. We were eating dinner bean soup with dried herbs, a meal that had become rotation standard when Connie mentioned that she'd noticed someone had accessed the root cellar during the night. 2 cans of peaches were missing from the inventory she'd cataloged the day before. The table went silent. 12 people, seated on chairs, stools, and upturned crates, looking at each other across bowls of soup. The arithmetic of suspicion is devastating in a small group. Every pair of eyes becomes an accusation. Every averted gaze becomes an admission. "Nobody leaves this table until we sort this out," Frank said. "That sounds like an interrogation," Travis replied. "It sounds like inventory management. 2 cans of food represent a day's nutrition for one person. In our current situation, that matters." Benny spoke up. "I took them." Everyone looked at him. He was a compact man with a close-trimmed beard and quiet hands that were always building or fixing something. He met Frank's gaze without defiance or apology. "Dion hasn't been eating enough. Kid's 6 years old and he's losing weight. Keisha asked me to get him something with sugar in it because he won't eat the beans." Keisha closed her eyes. Dion, beside her, was focused on his soup and oblivious to the tension he'd unwittingly caused. "You could have asked," Frank said. "Would you have said yes?" "Yes, but next time, you ask. Because the next time someone takes something without asking, the trust that keeps this group functional breaks. And without trust, supplies become meaningless." The incident resolved. Benny apologized. Frank adjusted the rationing to include a small discretionary allocation for the children. But the damage was done not to the physical supplies, which were trivially affected, but to the psychological architecture of the group. We had demonstrated to ourselves that we were capable of suspicion, secrecy, and unilateral action. Those capabilities don't disappear once revealed. They wait. On the 7th day, the deadline Frank had set for reassessment, the question of whether Travis's group would stay became irrelevant. The valley's situation had deteriorated to the point where sending anyone back onto the road was effectively a death sentence. The infected had reached Lexington. Sade spotted the first ones from her watch position and a group of 6 moving down Main Street in the early morning, their silhouettes visible against the pale dawn. By afternoon, Diana's radio contact with Curtis in Buena Vista went silent mid-transmission. His last words were, "They're through the bridge barricade. We're falling back to—" and then nothing. Connie, who had driven to check on her cattle that morning, returned at speed, the truck fishtailing on the gravel drive. She came into the house breathing hard, her camouflage jacket torn at the sleeve. "There are dozens on Collier Road. They came through the tree line from the east, probably following the creek bed. I almost drove into a group of them. One grabbed the truck mirror before I could pull away." She showed us her arm. No break in the skin, but the fabric was ripped clean, the force of the grip evident in the pattern of the tear. "Did any of them follow you here?" Frank asked. "I don't think so. I took the long way around, through the Hendricks property. But if they're on Collier Road, they're less than 4 miles from us." The next 12 hours were the most intensely focused work I've ever done. We fortified the house with everything available: furniture against doors, plywood reinforced with screws instead of nails, tripwires extended to a 100-yard perimeter. Frank and Marcus built a platform on the barn roof that provided an elevated observation and firing position. Connie distributed weapons rifles to those who could shoot, axes and tools to those who couldn't. Lena pulled me aside during a brief break. We stood in the upstairs hallway, out of earshot. Her face was drawn but composed. "I need to tell you something about the sedatives I brought from the clinic." "What about them?" "Ketamine and midazolam. In the right doses, they could incapacitate a human being, maybe even one of the infected, if their nervous system is still responsive to chemical suppression." "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because if someone gets bitten, we need a humane option. The broadcasts said 12 hours to fever, 6 more to full conversion. That's an 18-hour window. 18 hours of watching someone you know become something else. I'd rather have a plan for that than face it unprepared." I looked at her. In the dim light of the hallway, her eyes held a sadness that I hadn't seen before. Not fear, not despair, but the particular grief of a person who is trained to save lives, contemplating the circumstances under which saving might become impossible. "Okay," I said. "We have a plan. Joel." She took my hand. "The 4 seconds." "What?" "The tone. You heard it for 4 seconds. It's been 10 days and you're fine. I think you're clear." I hadn't realized how much that question had been weighing on me until she lifted it. The uncertainty about whether the sound had planted something inside me, some dormant mechanism waiting for a trigger, had been running beneath every other thought like a subsonic frequency. Lena's words didn't eliminate the possibility, but they gave me permission to set it down for a while. "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me. Stay alive." We returned downstairs to find the group in the kitchen, gathered around Diana's radio. A new voice was broadcasting a woman, calm and authoritative, identifying herself as a Colonel Sanders from the Virginia National Guard. She was addressing anyone listening in the Shenandoah Valley. "A forward operating base has been established at the Staunton-Augusta County Airport. All uninfected civilians are advised to proceed to this location for processing, shelter, and eventual evacuation. Repeat, Staunton Airport. Military protection is active. Bring identification and essential supplies only. This broadcast will repeat on this frequency every 30 minutes. The room divided instantly. Travis wanted to go. Connie didn't trust it. Frank wanted more information. Keisha wanted safety for Dion. Marcus wanted to know what processing meant. Walter sat in the corner and said nothing, his breathing worse than it had been a week ago. Military protection means military control, Travis said. But military control also means they have resources we don't: medicine, ammunition, organized defenses. We can't hold this farmhouse against a real wave. We don't know if that broadcast is current, Frank replied. It could be automated. The base could already be overrun. Or it could be our only chance. The argument spiraled for an hour. I listened and watched and felt the fault lines in the group illuminate with each exchange. Travis and Frank were locked in a power dynamic that had been building since the first handshake at the fence. Connie aligned with Frank out of pragmatic loyalty. Keisha aligned with Travis out of maternal calculus. Lena occupied the analytical middle, weighing medical realities. Diana held the radio like a talisman, the last physical connection to a world that might still be organized. We voted. 7 for investigating the base, 5 for staying. Democracy, even in its simplest form, is a mechanism for converting disagreement into action. We would go to Staunton, all of us, because splitting the group meant halving our capability and doubling our vulnerability. We would leave at dawn. The convoy departed at 5:30 a.m. under a sky the color of old iron. 2 vehicles, my Civic and Connie's truck, carrying 12 people and as much supply as we could fit. Frank drove the truck with Diana, Connie, and Walter. I drove the Civic with Lena, Travis, Keisha, Dion, Sade, Marcus, and Benny, packed in with a disregard for seatbelt laws that would have been comical under different circumstances. The route to Staunton was 40 miles on I-81 North, but we avoided the interstate based on every lesson we'd learned about highways becoming traps. Instead, Frank plotted a path through back roads Route 11 to Route 252 to a series of county roads that wound through farmland and small communities. The first 20 miles were quiet. The landscape was achingly beautiful autumn in the Shenandoah Valley. The mountains dressed in copper and gold, mist in the hollows, split rail fences running along roads that predated the automobile. We passed farms where cattle still grazed, indifferent to the collapse of human civilization. We passed a church with its doors open and its parking lot empty. We passed a school with a banner reading Fall Harvest Festival, October 28th, a celebration that would never happen. At mile 22, we encountered the first obstruction. A line of vehicles blocked a narrow bridge over a creek, not crashed, but deliberately positioned. A barricade built by someone with the same instinct Frank had shown. We stopped and assessed. The barricade was unmanned. No one responded to Frank's horn or my shouted announcements. We spent 30 minutes moving a compact car enough to squeeze through. On the far side of the bridge, the road passed through a small town, just a handful of houses, a post office, a volunteer fire station. The fire station's bay doors were open and the truck was gone. On the wall of the post office, someone had spray-painted in red letters, "Staunton is a trap." Everyone saw it. Nobody spoke for a full minute. "Could be anyone," Travis said. "Could be someone who went and didn't like the setup. Could be someone who never went and was guessing. Could be someone who went and didn't come back," Connie replied from the truck's window. Frank made the call to continue. The warning was noted, but turning back to the farmhouse, which we'd left unsecured, with no guarantee the base wasn't operational, seemed like a worse option than proceeding with caution. At mile 35, 5 miles from Staunton, we saw the helicopters, 2 Blackhawks circling in a wide pattern over the airport's location. Their rotors caught the morning light, and threw glints across the valley. Military presence. Active operations. Whatever the spray-painted warning meant, someone was still there. The road into the airport complex was flanked by Jersey barriers and concertina wire. A checkpoint manned by 4 soldiers in combat gear stopped us at a gate. The lead soldier, young, probably 23, with the rigid posture of someone operating on caffeine and regulation, approached Frank's window with a clipboard. "How many in your group?" 12. "Anyone bitten, scratched, or exposed to infected bodily fluids?" "No." "Anyone experiencing fever, headache, disorientation, or unusual aggression?" Frank glanced at me through the rearview mirror. I thought of the phone call. 4 seconds, 10 days ago. No symptoms. "No," Frank said. We were directed to a processing area, a series of tents erected on the airport tarmac. Hundreds of people were already there, organized into lines that fed into medical screening stations. The scale was larger than I'd expected, but smaller than I'd hoped. This wasn't a full evacuation center. It was a triage point, a temporary structure that had the feel of something assembled by competent people operating under impossible constraints. Lena and Keisha were pulled aside for their medical backgrounds and integrated into the screening operation almost immediately. Frank, Connie, San, and I were processed through a standard intake: names, addresses, skills, medical histories. A corporal with kind eyes and a clipboard that had seen better days told us that evacuation flights were running to a secure zone in West Virginia, but the schedule was backlogged. Estimated wait: 3 to 5 days. Travis was watching the soldiers. I was watching Travis. His assessment of the military presence wasn't hostile, but it was thorough. He noted the weapon types, the patrol patterns, the gaps in the perimeter with the unconscious competence of someone who had been in situations where such observations were survival skills. I didn't know Travis's history and he hadn't volunteered it, but in that moment I understood that whatever his life had been before the outbreak, it had included environments where authority was something you navigated around, not toward. We were assigned a section of a large tent, sleeping bags and MREs, a portable toilet station behind the hangars, the infrastructure of organized survival, impersonal but functional. Dion ate his first full meal in days and fell asleep against Keisha's shoulder. For one night, it felt like we'd made the right choice. The base operated on a rhythm that approximated normalcy through sheer institutional will. Wake up at 0600. Meal distribution at 0700. Work assignments at 0800. Civilians with useful skills were folded into the operation medical personnel to the screening tents, engineers and mechanics to infrastructure maintenance, able-bodied volunteers to perimeter reinforcement. Those without applicable skills were assigned to sanitation, food preparation, or childcare in a tent that someone had optimistically labeled Community Center with a hand-drawn banner. Frank was immediately valuable. His structural engineering background made him the most qualified person on the base for assessing and improving defensive fortifications. And within 24 hours, he was working directly with a Captain Elaine Royce, the base's operational commander, redesigning the perimeter barriers based on observed patterns of infected movement. I was assigned to communications, my telecom background apparently the closest thing they had to a signal specialist. The military's own communications team was a skeleton crew of 2 specialists managing equipment that was partially operational and partially cannibalized for parts. They showed me the setup: a bank of field radios, a satellite uplink that worked intermittently, and a civilian ham station they'd confiscated from a local enthusiast. The satellite connection to Fort Detrick drops every 4 hours and takes between 20 minutes and 6 hours to reestablish, said Specialist Kim, a compact woman with a shaved head and dark circles under her eyes. The landlines are dead. Cell towers are down in an 80-mile radius. We're basically communicating by radio and prayer. What's the command structure above this base? Colonel Hendricks at Fort Detrick is our nominal superior, but we haven't had clean contact in 48 hours. Last confirmed order was to hold position and process civilians for evacuation. The evac flights come from a joint base in West Virginia when they come. We've had 3 in 7 days. 3 flights in 7 days. The base held roughly 400 civilians and was growing daily. The math was bleak. I spent my first day restoring partial functionality to the satellite uplink by replacing a corroded connector I improvised from components in a broken field radio. When the uplink synced and a burst of data came through, Specialist Kim looked at me like I'd performed a miracle. "Can you keep doing that?" she asked. "Until we run out of things to cannibalize." The data burst contained updated intelligence. The infection had spread to 37 states. The eastern seaboard from Maine to Florida was classified as a total loss zone. The military had established a defensive line along the Appalachian Range, using the mountain terrain as a natural barrier. But the line was porous and being tested constantly. International reports were fragmentary. Europe was experiencing its own outbreak, origin unclear, possibly independent, possibly connected through air travel before grounding orders took effect. China had gone dark 12 days ago. No one knew what that meant. I found Lena in the medical tent that evening. She was finishing a 12-hour shift and looked like she'd aged a year in a day. Her scrubs were stained with antiseptic, and she had the 1,000-yard focus of someone who'd been making life and death assessments on a conveyor belt. 3 bites today, she said, sitting on an empty cot and rubbing her eyes. 3 people who made it here, passed the checkpoint screening and showed symptoms within hours. The incubation period is getting shorter, Joel, or people are getting better at hiding bites. What happened to them? Isolation tent, sedation. The military protocol is... She paused, choosing words. The military protocol is definitive. I understood what she meant. The base had a policy for infected individuals, and that policy didn't include long-term observation or hopes for recovery. The isolation tent was at the far edge of the tarmac, separated from everything else by 50 yards of open ground, and a detail of 2 soldiers who stood with their rifles at a readiness that communicated everything the official briefings didn't. I used the ketamine today, Lena said quietly, on a woman about my age. She'd been bitten on the forearm and wrapped it with a scarf. Made it through screening, started seizing in the meal line. I sedated her before the soldiers could reach her because I wanted her last conscious moments to not be... She stopped. I wanted her to be asleep for it. I sat beside her and put my arm around her shoulders. She leaned into me and we stayed like that for a long time. 2 people holding each other in a canvas tent on the tarmac of a small Virginia airport, while civilization contracted around us like a wound closing from the edges inward. On the 3rd day, the base's fragile equilibrium cracked. It started with Walter. The old electrician had been declining since before we left the farmhouse, his breathing progressively worse, his energy flagging. Keisha, monitoring him with Lena's guidance, had suspected pneumonia even before we arrived. At the base, he was assessed by a military medic who confirmed the diagnosis and started him on antibiotics from a limited supply. But on the 3rd morning, Walter woke with a fever of 103. In the old world, this would have been a medical concern requiring treatment and rest. In the new world, a fever was a death sentence's opening argument. The soldiers came within an hour of the report, measured and professional, and told Walter he'd be moved to the isolation tent for observation. Walter looked at me from his cot with the resigned clarity of a man who understood the mechanism he'd been fed into. I wasn't bitten, he said. I'm sick, not infected. I know, I said. They'll confirm that. Will they? Will they wait long enough to confirm it? Or will the protocol be definitive? I went to Captain Royce's office, a partitioned section of a hangar, and argued Walter's case. Lena came with me, presenting the medical evidence. Walter had a documented pre-existing respiratory condition. His symptoms were consistent with bacterial pneumonia, not the infection. A simple blood test or observation period would distinguish the two. Royce listened. She was a practical woman in her 40s with a face that had been refined by years of decision-making into an expression of permanent assessment. She agreed to a 24-hour observation period with medical monitoring. Walter survived the observation. His fever responded to antibiotics. He was returned to the general population the next morning. But the incident had illuminated something corrosive. The basis system was designed for efficiency, not nuance. And in the gap between those two concepts, innocent people could disappear. The evacuation flight came on day 5. A single C-130 Hercules dropped out of a gray sky and landed on the airport's short runway with the confidence of a pilot who'd made this approach before and hoped not to make it again. The plane could carry 120 civilians. The base held 430. Captain Royce established the priority list: families with children under 12, medical personnel, individuals with critical skills for the receiving base. The rest would wait for the next flight timeline unknown. Keisha and Dion were on the list. So was Lena, classified as medical essential. When she saw her name on the manifest posted outside the command tent, she came to find me immediately. I'm not going without you. You're going because you can save people on the other end. That's not negotiable. Joel, listen to me. I took her hands. Her fingers were cold despite the day's warmth. Frank and Diana are on the next priority tier because of Frank's engineering skills. I'm useful here with the communications equipment. I'll be on the next flight. You don't know that. I know that staying together means you give up a seat that could go to someone who can't advocate for themselves. I know that your skills matter more at a secure facility than they do here. And I know that you know I'm right, which is why you're angry instead of arguing. She held my gaze for a long time. I memorized her face in that moment, not because I thought I'd never see her again, but because I understood that the next time I did, we would both be different people. The experience was rewriting us in real time, and the versions of ourselves standing on that tarmac existed in a present tense that was already becoming past. 4 seconds, she said. What? You heard the tone for 4 seconds and stayed yourself. Whatever comes next, remember that you were strong enough to resist the thing that started all of this. She kissed me, boarded the plane with Keisha and Dion and Sade and 46 other people whose names I never learned. And the C-130 climbed into a sky the color of chalk and banked west toward mountains I couldn't see. Travis found me standing on the tarmac after the plane disappeared. She'll be fine, he said. It was the first uncalculated thing I'd heard him say. You stayed. The list wasn't going to include me, and you know why. A black man with no family attachment and no verifiable professional skills isn't anyone's evacuation priority. Marcus and Benny either. That's not bitterness, it's arithmetic. I wanted to argue. I couldn't. The priority system was functionally neutral but practically biased in ways that were invisible to people for whom the system had always worked. Travis saw the bias because he'd spent a lifetime navigating systems that weren't built for him. Then we make sure the next flight happens, I said. Over the following days, Travis and I developed an alliance I hadn't expected. He helped me with the communications equipment, displaying an intuitive understanding of electronics that he attributed to a youth spent modifying car audio systems and a brief apprenticeship at an IT repair shop. Together, we improved the satellite uplink's reliability and established a consistent radio network, connecting the base to 3 other military outposts in the region. But the situation was deteriorating faster than our improvements could compensate. The infected were massing in larger groups, and their behavior was evolving. Early encounters had suggested disorganized, individual movement. Now, Diana's radio contacts reported groups of 20, 30, 50, moving in loose formations that, while not coordinated in any tactical sense, demonstrated a kind of collective momentum, a herd behavior that multiplied their threat exponentially. On the 8th night, they hit the base. The perimeter alarm, a system of motion sensors Frank had helped install, triggered at 2:17 a.m. I was in the communications tent when the first shots came, a staccato eruption that shattered the base's sleeping quiet. I grabbed the radio and heard Captain Royce's voice, clipped and operational. Breach, North Perimeter, Section 4. All available security to Section 4. This is not a drill. It wasn't a drill, and it wasn't containable. Somewhere between 80 and 100 infected had come through a drainage culvert that ran beneath the perimeter barrier, a structural weakness Frank had identified, but that hadn't been reinforced due to material shortages. They poured onto the tarmac like water through a broken levee, and the base erupted into an hours of desperate, chaotic defense that I experienced in fragments. Muzzle flashes, screaming, the sound of bodies colliding. Travis pulling me behind a concrete barrier as a figure lunged past us close enough that I felt the displacement of air. When it was over, 17 people were dead. 11 soldiers, 6 civilians. 23 more had been bitten. The north perimeter was destroyed. The isolation tent was overwhelmed. Captain Royce made the evacuation call at dawn. Everyone out, all vehicles. Convoy west. The base was no longer viable. We left Staunton at 6 a.m. in a column of military and civilian vehicles that stretched a quarter mile. Frank drove. Connie rode shotgun with a rifle across her lap. I sat in the back beside Travis, Marcus, and Benny. Diana held her radio in the truck bed, still listening, still writing in her notebook. Walter had died in the attack, not bitten. His heart had given out during the chaos, the stress, the pneumonia, the impossible demands placed on a body that had already been failing. Benny had carried him into the medical tent and sat with him until it was over. I didn't look back at the airport as we drove away. There was nothing behind us that looking would improve. 6 weeks later, I'm writing this from a settlement in the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. 30 prefabricated structures, a functioning medical clinic, solar power, well water, and a population of 312 people who have each survived their own version of this story. Lena is here. She was waiting when our convoy arrived, standing at the gate with that steady gaze I'd crossed a state to see again. Frank and Diana are here. Connie is here, already managing the settlement's food production with the same quiet authority she brought to her cattle ranch. Travis is on the security team. Marcus and Benny are building. I still think about the phone calls. 16 missed calls from a number that can't exist. A tone that pressed against the inside of my skull for 4 seconds and then let me go. I don't know if it was a weapon, a warning, or something else entirely, something beyond the categories I have for understanding the world. I know that it started the night before everything ended, and I know that I survived it. 4 seconds. That's the margin between what I was and what I could have become. I carry that knowledge now the way you carry a scar, not with pride, not with pain, but with a permanent awareness that the boundary between who you are and who you aren't is thinner than anyone wants to believe.